Boker Tov. We're going to start off this Monday morning, number one, with may our learning be for Refuah Shalema. For unfortunately the many that need it, so Refuah Shalema to all. Included, we'll have specifically in mind for Rochel Bas El Tachaya, Sheshav Refuah Shalema, V'Sach Shar Chole Yisrael. We should hear good news during these most challenging and unprecedented times. Also, the learning will be Lila Nishma Samar Weinstock Yechiel Meir Ben Yehuda, who had a very special place in his heart for this congregation, and whose levaya was yesterday. This was not a levaya as a levaya should be for a person who did so much, but we're dealing with challenging times, very challenging times, but we are a nation that could turn to great personalities of the past to inspire us to overcome challenges. And that's what we do with optimism, with faith, that Bezrat Hashem as a nation we're going to overcome, but we should continue doing our part during these times. Now I'm going to start off with a question. Really, our discussion today has to do with the laws of Pesach, and we're going to hopefully have the opportunity to address a few of the laws, the minhagim, as we prepare for Pesach, for the Seder nights. And before we get to a few specifics that relate to the uniqueness of this year, I'm going to start off with a question. I merited for many years here in B'nai Torah to sit right next to Jack Kahn, Olav Shalom, and he, if you know how things were structured, he sat right next to me. And although I tried to the best of my ability not to talk during davening, but if there's one person that here and there I would exchange a word with at times that it's 100% permissible, it would be Jack Kahn. So I think every single year we would have our conversation on the 8th day of Pesach, that relates to Gebrokst. In other words, the tradition that exists by some communities that they don't place their matzah in their soup or do not allow their matzah to come in contact with water. And it's a practice that existed in Hasidic and by many of the Hungarian communities, especially to the east of Hungary, that was impacted by Hasidic culture. And we would talk about it because he would note it's not from my home, but from Ma'eshes Chayil, it's part of her tradition. And therefore we get the excitement on the 8th day of Pesach of eating the knedlach. And that was exciting. And we would have this brief discussion that relates to the question, in general, we are told that minhagim, and Pesach is really all about minhagim, that minhagim come from the husband. When there's a couple that marries, there's an understanding that you follow the minhagim of the husband. But when it relates to food, who on earth is the husband to have an opinion? What, he's going to come into the kitchen? What kind of chutzpah do you have, right? That when the wife is toiling away, you walk in with your minhagim. Like, who are you? Like, what is this? So this is a brief discussion we would have about minhagim coming from the husband, coming from the wife. So this is a question that we could ask. Is it really true that it only depends on the husband? Obviously, it's not. And I was looking for a very early source for this idea that the wife walks into the marriage with her own traditions, her own practices, and how much historically you take it into consideration. Okay, so you could call this brief discussion the earliest roots of feminism in Orthodoxy. You could have, if you really want to label our brief discussion now. So that's the short question, by the way. And I have a little bit of a longer answer, not too long because we have other things to cover. So to appreciate this discussion, we have to start off with a rabbinic figure who is extremely significant for Ashkenazim and even more so for German communities. And his name was Rabbi Yaakov Moelin. Rabbi Yaakov Moali, known as the Maharil. Maharil. And he's quoted hundreds of times, hundreds, if not thousands of times in halachic literature, because when you talk about minhagei Ashkenaz, German customs, and especially when you interact with Yekis who really want to stick to the old German minhagim like my late grandfather, you have to know about the Maharil, the great rabbinic authority, died in 1427, but he is the father of minhagei Ashkenaz. Okay, and a lot of old traditions that we are familiar with, that we've heard of, you could trace back to the Maharil, and there are dozens. I'll just share one or two, perhaps. The tradition of when you burn the chametz, which we'll discuss later about this year, that things are a little bit different. The custom that when you burn the chametz, you also burn the spoon. You burn the wooden spoon. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Burning a spoon. You go through Talmudic literature, there's no spoon burning, okay? But there was a tradition to burn the wooden spoon, and it was so important that there was a time that tzedakah organizations would send out before Pesach, the tzedakah organizations before they would send out the charoses, which usually goes straight from mailbox to garbage can. There's one of the yeshivas that sends that. And then there are tzedakah organizations that send you the 10 pieces of bread, just in case you don't know how to prepare it. And sometimes it comes late, it arrives during Pesach, and that's a different shaila you have to address. So then there's the tzedakah organization that sends you a spoon. What's the idea of burning a spoon? So believe it or not, it has its roots in the Maharil. That the Maharil tells us that if you do a bdikat chametz on the eve of the 14th of Nisan, and you don't find anything, not to forget the concept of burning chametz, you know what you should do? Burn the spoon. Burn the spoon. So there is such a practice. Where does such an old Ashkenazi custom come from? The Maharil. This is very halachic and very complex, because when it comes to Pesach and kashering for Pesach, some of the traditions are beyond halacha, which makes it very complex, because usually, the rabbinic student sits down and he studies Yored De'ah, the areas in Jewish law that relates to kashering. And when Pesach has traditions that don't fit into that mold, you don't know how to work with it. And one example that shares with us difficulty is that the Maharil, right? Rabbi Yaakov Moelet tells us that a chatzuva, which is a tripod, which basically they would have some coals, put on it some kind of metal tripod and put the pot on it. So Maharil says, chatzuva tzarich libun. You have to kasher it. You have to kasher it, which makes no sense, and I'll tell you why. Do you have burners in your home? If the burner is clean, you could use it for fleishiks and then for milchiks. Why? Because nothing is transferred from the top of the metal to the pot, right? Nothing is transferred from burner to pot if it is dry. That's the rule throughout the year. So technically speaking, if you have a chatzuva tripod and it's clean, right? And I use it for chametz, I could use it afterwards for matzah, for a pot that has in it matzah. There's no issue. There's no transfer, logically. But nevertheless, Maharil says, chatzuva tzarich libun. And this creates, by the way, this Maharil statement creates a problem. Because let's say you have a glass top stovetop. That's probably a better name. And if you follow the Maharil and you put together some other Ashkenazi stringencies, like, for example, that we don't kasher glass, you theoretically cannot kasher it, which is problematic. So obviously the poskim afterwards, who are not completely obligated to follow Maharil to the full extent, come up with different ways of addressing it, and that's what the poskim do, like Rabbi Akiva Eger. But nevertheless, the discussion tells you the fact that for the past 600 years, we've been struggling with this question, how to deal with the chatzuva, tells you the significance of the Maharil. Okay, so that's introduction number one to the answer that we are going to give that relates to our question about minhagim and women. You with me so far? Good. I can see the nods. I like those nods. Okay. Now, next, when I was learning up about the Maharil, at one point, and it was mentioned that he would give a Shabbos Hagadol drasha, which Bezrat Hashem, next week, same place, same time, we will have the opportunity. Almighty will assist us that we will have our Shabbos Hagadol right here, 10:15 a.m. on Monday. So Shabbos Hagadol drasha, the Maharil. So this is early 15th century. He would ask Reshut. In other words, when he would get up to give his drasha, he was a Rosh Yeshiva there in Magenz and Mainz. So he would ask Reshut. He would ask permission from the great rabbi in town. So who was the rabbi in town when the Maharil was teaching? And this is always interesting. The Maharil we've heard of. The rabbi who, okay. So by the way, the Maharil is not just a random person. The wolves visited the Maharil's grave in Worms. Just you should know that the significance that the wolves visited the Maharil's grave. And it's an important authority. And I'm really serious. As a good Jew, we should be familiar with who our rabbinic figures are. Maharil is up there. What surprised me is the fact that the Maharil asked permission before he would address the crowd is not known at all. And I would be surprised if any of us even heard the name. But here's the new name, and this is the person I would like to focus on a touch, that the Maharil would be mevakesh notel reshut. He would ask permission before he would give his drasha from Reb, here we go, Zalman Runkil, Reish, Vav, Nun, Kuf, Yud, Lamed. Reb Zalman Runkil. Don't know, okay. And obviously a great rabbi, Maharil would not be asking him, a great rabbi. So I decided I want to do a little bit more research into Reb Zalman Runkil of the early 15th century. So first of all, I found something halachic from him that usually is attributed to much later authorities. So I was very excited to find this halachic insight. So now I'm going to start off with a halachic teaching from Reb Zalman Runkil. There's a section in the Talmud that talks about a barrel, and people would have cracks and holes and crevices in their barrel. So throughout the year, the best material for plugging a hole in a barrel before Play-Doh or before putty or whatever you use today was actually a mixture of flour and water. Flour and water, known to us as chametz. So the Talmud talks about a barrel that has a little bit of basically dough in it. So we are told that if it's in one vessel, even if the sections are less than a kezait, even if it's less than a kezait, even if it's a small amount of dough, if within the whole barrel it has in it dough, that if you bring together all of it, you would have one kezait, you have an issue. Even if in individual sections, it's a very small amount. This is what the Talmud tells us, okay? Now, it also depends if it was sitting in the barrel a long time, if it dried out, it didn't dry out. A very detailed discussion, but what is relevant for us is the fact that the Talmud seems to indicate that even a small amount of dough could create a problem. Okay, that's statement number one in the Talmud. Statement number two in the Talmud in a different section, earlier on in Tractate Pesachim, the Talmud tells us that, listen, when you are in your house and you want to nullify chametz or clean for chametz, don't worry about perurin. Don't worry about perurim. What are perurim? Crumbs. Because perurim betili, they're nullified. What the Talmud seems to be telling you is that if you go ahead and walk around with a toothpick to remove crumbs in between cracks and crevices that are not even edible, it's not a halachic requirement. I would say mishuga, but I'm not going to say mishuga because there's a tradition that for Pesach, when people do things that are not needed, you should still respect them. So it's not necessary at all, according to the Talmud and according to halacha, because perurim betili. So here comes the question. If you take these two sections of the Talmud, you're going to walk away with a little bit of an issue. Because on the one hand, we are told small amounts of dough could be a problem. On the other hand, we are told a small amount of crumbs, batel, it's nullified. That's not what we're checking for when you do bdikat chametz. And that's, by the way, halacha. You're not looking for crumbs. What you're looking for is for some food, a candy bar, a wafer that was concealed, right? If there are two peoples in the household and one's in a diet and trying to hide from the other one that they are breaking the diet, for example, and they conceal behind shelves cookies, right? And the wife is trying to monitor what the husband is eating, and he hides cookies throughout the house, correct? That is what you are looking for in bdikat chametz. You are not looking for crumbs. So how do you deal with the contradiction? So comes Reb Zalman Runkel, blessed memory, and Reb Zalman Runkel tells us that you should know there is a difference between perurin and dough. Perurin are nullified. You don't have to worry about them. But dough, the normal thing to do with dough is, if you make bread, is that if you have small amounts of dough, you bring them together and you combine them. That's what you do. So therefore, there is more of a stringency with dough than with crumbs. That's what Reb Zalman Runkel says. Now, it's exciting for me because I would usually quote this in the name of the Pri Chadash, which is a 17th century authority. So it's quite exciting to find it in the name of a 15th century authority. So now you know a little bit about Reb Zalman Runkel, and he was significant, and Maharil would ask him for permission. And now it's time to get to our issue. Okay, all this was an introduction, but this is even before the class. This is all an introduction. So here we go. This is something I found recently. That Shamati, I'll read the story, is that it was Leil Yudalid, the eve of the 14th of Nisan. And it was time for bdikat chametz. And although we are all familiar with the minhag of putting out the 10 pieces of bread, in the early 15th century, it was not yet an established custom. Some did it, some did not do it. Some did it because they felt, hey, if the house is clean, we should put out a few pieces of chametz to be sure that the bracha, the blessing made, is not a bracha levatala, it's not a blessing in vain. So therefore, before they pick up their candle and their feather and their wooden spoon, perhaps in the mouth because candle's in one hand and the feather is in the other hand, they would be careful to put out the 10 pieces of bread. That was by some. Others believe this is narishkeit, not necessary. What are you coming up with new traditions? The Talmud says you check. If you find, good. If you don't find, also good. The mitzvah is the checking. The mitzvah is not the find. So these were the two schools that existed in late 14th, early 15th century. And it appears that Reb Zalman and his wife came from different traditions. Reb Zalman and his wife came from different traditions. So here we go. So Pam Achat, I'm reading to you, that one time, Reb Zalman Runkel's wife placed chametz belel yudalit. She put out the 10 pieces of bread, kedei sheimtza oto beshat bdikato, for the purpose that they should be found during the checking on the eve of the 14th. V'noda lo hadavar, when Reb Zalman Runkel found out, ka'as, he was upset. And he believed that this creates a problem because now the house's status changed. Until now, the status was a house that had no chametz because we checked it and cleaned it. But now with those 10 pieces of bread, he believed that we have to recheck, we have to re-clean the whole house. V'tziva lechabed kol habayit pam shenit. Tziva, he commanded that they should go ahead again and clean out the whole house again. So he was very unhappy with the practice of his wife. Now, she did it because she came from a different tradition. Okay, now we are told that even though he got upset and he said to the wife, we're going to have to clean the house again, ve'afal piken, she, the wife, lo mana'a milahaniach lo bechol shana. She did this every single year. Meaning, because from her house, or her tradition was, that before b'dikat chametz, you put out the 10 pieces of bread. So she couldn't care less that the husband was not happy with it. The Rovenstadt, she couldn't care. She continued putting out the 10 pieces of bread. Ki hi ameret, she used to say, shekach kibla biyadam avotea. That's my tradition. It's my tradition. Your tradition is to get upset. Fine. My tradition is I'm putting out those 10 pieces of bread. Ubechol pam, but he continued that every single year he would go ahead and say, we have to clean the house again. So that became the norm. If you would visit Reb Zalman Runkel's house in the early 15th century, you would see that she would put out the pieces of bread. He would get upset. He would say, let's clean again. They would clean again. And that was their minhag. And I wonder if it's stuck in their family too, the minhag of getting upset and cleaning up. I wonder that to an extent. But at least we have here a source from early 15th century of a wife that tells her husband regarding his minhagim gei pfeifen. In other words, I'm doing it my way. So this was a little bit of an interesting piece of information that I found from Reb Zalman Runkel and his wife. May their neshamas benefit from the fact that we are learning and entertained by their interactions. Okay, here we go. It's a unique year. It's a unique year with questions that we have never really dealt with. And, you know, when it comes to rabbis in general, if they've been doing Pesach and Erev Pesach as a rabbi for many years, they can expect basically 99.9% of the questions, right? And many of the issues are the popular or the common issues that someone picked up an item in the supermarket. It was in the kosher Pesach section. It wasn't kosher Pesach. That's kashanim ketiknan. That's most years. This is not a regular year. And we're dealing with all kind of questions. And therefore, it's important to understand that we have to reemphasize things. So, for example, there's a magnificent psak of Rav Hershel Schachter that's circulating, and I saw it in his handwriting, and it's a good psak to remember. Historically, there was a time when 25, 30 years ago, when people would be using pill medication for Pesach, they would call someone that had this booklet. This is before the internet. And in the booklet, there would be a list of medications where the binder is not chametz. And that's how they would be determining if their blood pressure medication or their thyroid medication is okay for Pesach or not. Eventually, and this goes back already 15, 20 years ago, it became very clear, and this was known before, but was ignored by many, pills that are taken as medicine that are not chewable and not flavored and are swallowed do not need hashgacha for Pesach. Because even if it has within it some chametz, it's not called achila. It's not called eating, period. Okay? Now, even though there is the Talmud talks about what's known as a kupat seor sheyichda liyeshiva, which would mean they had a brick of sourdough, and it was used as a starter. And that's when the Torah tells us that during Pesach, you must be careful not to find within your domain, not chametz and not seor. It was sourdough. It was like a block. It wasn't really edible. It was not edible. Now, the Torah tells us you have to get rid of it. However, if a person decides to make a little benkel, a little bench out of it, so if they go ahead, they smear the top a little bit, they go ahead and make it clear that this is not going to be used as sourdough anymore, you don't have to get rid of it. Now, the Talmud says, even though there's no requirement to get rid of it in some situations, don't eat it on Pesach. Because by eating something, even if it's technically not really edible, you make it, you're eating it elevates its status and makes it edible. For example, today, children, it was popular, I don't know how popular it is today, that they make these art projects in school, not for Pesach, with pieces of macaroni. Is it still in? I don't know, we'd have to ask the next generation. So they have macaroni, you have a little piece of paper, they're in a kindergarten, they color the macaroni blue, they glue it to a piece of paper, and it says on it Shabbat Shalom, for example. So people usually get rid of it before Pesach, but technically speaking, if the blue color that is used is not really there for human consumption, painting it makes it no longer edible, and therefore, technically speaking, it would be fine to keep that on the wall, technically speaking. Nevertheless, we all agree that you shouldn't be swallowing that macaroni on Pesach because it is achsheve. You are, by eating it, you are elevating its status. That's what we are told. And I'm mentioning that because that is only true if you chew on it. Pills, and this is the bottom line, and this is what's relevant. Don't worry about pills, right? Your medications that are in pill form are 100% fine. Nevertheless, over the past few years, even the poskim who made that statement clear, they noted that perhaps for vitamins, you could be a little bit more machmir because vitamins are not a necessity, meaning it's nice to have it to boost your immunity, all nice, but perhaps be machmir with vitamins. That's what poskim were saying. This year is different, says Rav Hesher Schechter, that this year, the greatest mitzvah you could do is to take care of your immunity, take care of your health. And if there's any benefit at all from vitamins, which obviously there are, take your vitamins. If it is not chewable and if it's not flavored, take your vitamins on Pesach. Take care of your health. This is a different year. Okay, so that's one piece of information that tells us that Manishtana, this year is indeed different. Also, when it comes to burning chametz, this is something we mentioned already. Burning is a minhag, okay? You don't have to burn if you can't. You could flush it down the toilet. You tend to take the 10 pieces of bread, flush it down the toilet. However, although most years you have the tradition of perhaps burning your aravos and your lulav with your chametz, please don't flush your lulav down the toilet. Please don't do it. It's not a good idea. I'm not a plumber, but I have a feeling that lulavim are not exactly right items to put down the toilet. That's all we need in the media now. Orthodox Jews, right, are not just making minyanim, but they are flushing palm branches down the toilet for religious reasons. So that's something that obviously we shouldn't do. There's been a lot of coverage about the Zoom, right? About the Zoom Seder. You heard the tumult a little bit? The Zoom. Some rabbis in Eretz Yisrael with incredible intentions mentioned the fact that people are lonely, and this is something we cannot minimize. This is going to be for many the most, if not one of the most difficult Seder experiences. So they came up with an idea of a Zoom. And the idea is that you put the camera on before Yom Tov, and you could go ahead and interact. And it appears that the great poskim are not giving their thumbs up. None of the great poskim gave their thumbs up. If individual cases, one is concerned about actual depression, obviously they should ask a shaila. But this is not a psak that got its stamp of approval from the significant poskim. But you got to give credit. You got to give credit to those who are working hard for the sake of the others who are going through the difficulty. Okay. Now, over the years, we've discussed a lot about machine, hand, shmura, not shmura. A brief review that we try very hard to the best of our ability to use shmura matzah for the Seder night. And shmura matzah that we try to use is from the time of harvest, mishat ktsira. Now that is a stringency that Klal Yisrael tries to the best of their ability to do. Reality is that all matzos really are matzah shmura. So therefore, in case of need, or if you know a relative that perhaps does not have a roots in tradition, and you hear that they only use regular kosher Pesach machine matzah, that too is a good thing. Ideally, you get matzah shmura mishat ktsira. What I've had to deal with my whole life is to explain to people that matzah shmura from the time of harvest, ktsira, does not mean it has to be handmade. There is such a thing as matzah shmura that's made by a machine. There is such a thing, and good Jews allow it. Now, if you have Hasidic roots, right, this is hard for you to hear, right? If you come from the eastern parts in Hungary, this sounds so unacceptable that how on earth can you say that machines that Moshe Rabbeinu and the Baal Shem Tov did not have, how can you go ahead and consider that acceptable? So I posted a picture, which I'm gonna, if you see here on the screen, and this is a pashkevil. Pashkevil is, as you know, up until this day in Yerushalayim, in some neighborhoods, they get their information from these printed posters that are plastered to a wall. So, for example, if you want to know what sins brought about the coronavirus, so you go to Me'asharim and you look on one of these pashkevils and you'll know exactly, because they obviously know everything why God is doing things, right? And that's pashkevil. So pashkevilim have roots that go back 150 years in Yerushalayim. Now, so this pashkevil comes from the year 1908, Taf Resh Samaches. And this is a very important one for me personally. And the reason is, when we in the past had a discussion about machine versus hand, we focused on Lvov, on Lemberg in 1857, 1858, and 1859. But there was a big to-do in Eretz Israel in the beginning of the 20th century, when there was Rabbi Yosef Minsker, who eventually merged with Halprin, and they still have, I think today, Halprin matzos, and he baked matzah shmura machine. For the Hasidim in Eretz Yisrael, for those who were followers of the tradition of the Baal Shem Tov, this was problematic. This was untraditional. However, there was a great rabbi in Yerushalayim by the name of Rav Naftali Amsterdam. Rav Naftali was one of the greatest disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And he was a very modest man that was not interested in publicity, not interested in his name appearing throughout the city or throughout the Jewish world, because he was a Musarnik. He worked on himself. But nevertheless, he felt obligated that I need to get everyone to know that the matzah is produced by the machine. Matzah is produced by Rabbi Yosef Minsker in the neighborhood of Mazkeret, okay, which you're going to have to go out and do your own research what neighborhood that is today. And he writes that even though in bold letters they are from machines, let me translate that, machines, he tells us the following. Be'enai ra'iti, I saw the process of the afiyah, and it's behidur, it's in a proper and halachically beautified way. And therefore, and he adds in the last two lines that I never was more satisfied with baking matzos than these matzos. And he signs Naftali Dov Amsterdam, and he notes that don't think I'm just this average person, you know who I am. You know who you're talking to. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, I'm a disciple of the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So this is taking place, and therefore in the Prussian, the non-Hasidic communities in Yerushalayim and in Eretz Israel, of the old Yeshuv even, they were allowing these machine matzos. Now, why is it significant for me? Because I saw by my grandfather, by my Saba, a title that belongs to old people until recently, right? That my Saba, Alav Shalom, at his Seder, he had machine shmura. And I once wondered where he got it from. And I have no doubt that due to the fact that my Saba was in Eretz Israel from 1924 to 1929, and was one of the 6 students who established the Hebron Yeshiva in the city of Hebron. And they were followers of the Musarite, of the followers of the Musar movement. I have no doubt that this message by Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam that was published, a good 16 years before my grandfather arrived, nevertheless had an impact on the matzos he was using for the Seder night, and therefore by me, it is Kodesh Kodashim to stick to my traditions. You're all welcome to eat your traditional hand matzos, but just please remember that I'm Jewish too, and others as well who eat machine, shmura, mishas ksira, with a good supervision are good Jews, so please view me as a member of your tribe as well. Mechirat chametz, mechirat chametz. You know that most of us have accustomed ourselves that the way you sell the chametz is that you come to the rabbi and you lift his handkerchief, or recently his pen, or even more recently his phone, and there's a kinyan. That's a nice thing to do. It's not a must. It's not a must. And therefore, by you indicating to the rabbi that you want your chametz sold, and by you sending the information to the rabbi with the proper location, right, with your address, right, and you sign that document that authorizes the rabbi to sell the chametz, that's good enough. Don't worry about the fact that you're not lifting the pen or the handkerchief. So please keep that in mind. And therefore, you could email me, you could drop it off in the shul mailbox. I sent out the documents. Worry not, it is 100% fine. What I do ask is that when you have chametz, keep it in a specific location and note the location. In other words, I'm not a big fan of keeping chametz in a refrigerator and sealing off that area. That's not an ideal. I should say not an ideal. In cases of need, you do all kinds of things. But the ideal would be that it should be in cupboards designated as chametz and have that area specified in the document that you could find. Like one example is you write in the document, all areas marked sold, all areas marked chametz. And then the buyer will know that he owns those areas. That's the proper and the ideal way to do it. A question I get often, a question that I get every year is, we know that on the one hand, we want to commemorate the Paschalaim, the Korban Pesach, but on the other hand, we don't want to eat roast, right? Because we are told, the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, to make it clear that the meat we eat Seder night is not the Korban Pesach, they tell us that you do not eat roast. Okay, so the question is, what about a pot roast? And unfortunately, I don't know a lot about cooking, and because I'm blessed with Baruch Hashem, Miriam does a lot of wonderful cooking on Pesach, and the kids actually know how to cook. Hillel is a good chef. I think he's watching, and Moshe too learned from him. So the fact is, I'm not an expert about cooking, but when it comes to a pot roast, as long as you have liquids on the bottom throughout the whole process, meaning that there are always liquids in the pot, even if it's a small amount on the bottom, but liquids themselves do produce the steam that assists in the cooking, that would be considered acceptable and not a problematic roast for the Seder. Okay, so keep in mind, pot roast, when there's liquid, that would be considered acceptable. Okay? Now, you could, when it comes to the forms of mechirat chametz, remember, you could go ahead and scan it, take a picture and email me the picture. You could scan it and email it to me. You could fill it out. I sent it out in a Word as well. You could fill it out as a worm, not as a worm, as I was reading David saying. You could fill it out. You could fill it out as a Word document. Okay. Now, roasted chicken is also not eaten at the Seder night. The similarity between meat and chicken is such that when the rabbis made a decree, you don't eat roasted chicken, but rather it should be in the same way, cooked with a little bit of liquid in the pot, because that became part of the tradition as well. Roasted fish would be fine, by the way, right? but that's what we have now. Shiurim. You remember when organizations would send out these flyers or printouts with how much matzah to eat? And my father used to share with me the story that Ner Yisrael, it would be nice if any of you, when you're cleaning out your houses, you could find in the late 1960s, were sending out these pre-Pesach publications or perhaps printouts with how much matzah to eat, And one year they got an update that from Ramosha Feinstein's household, you should perhaps increase it. Perhaps the measurement of the past was not good enough and you should eat a little bit more. So my father told me that he was a little bit perplexed because on the one hand, they've been sending out a specific measurement every year. To go ahead and send out a new measurement would be problematic. So this was a decision that had to be made at Ner Yisrael on Finch. So luckily at the time, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was visiting town. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky told him, Tfos Lishna Rishona, which is a statement in the Talmud that tells us that sometimes when there's a rabbi and there are two opinions shared in the same rabbi, one an earlier version and one a later one, you could go with the earlier version. So this is what Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky told my father, that you could go with the earlier version. So there's a lot of discussion about measurements and shiurim, and I'll tell you what I do, and then I'll tell you the minimal amount. What I try to do for the Seder night is the 22-11-22 rule. What I do is I eat, and again, I'm a lucky machine man, I eat for the Seder night 22 grams for and this is a significant amount, by the way, so you don't say I'm not a machmer. I eat 22 grams for my motzi matzah, 11 grams for my korach, and 22 grams for my afikomen. And that's the max. Technically speaking, and for people that have difficulty or issues with digestion or people that simply have difficulty with the matzah, even if you take a quarter of a machine matzah, you for sure fulfill your obligation. And reality is that the requirement for the Seder night is a kizait, the volume of an olive. And an olive is about the size of a thumb. So if you take matzah, and due to the fact that today it's thin, you would have to take a few small pieces, the amount that creates the volume of an olive would be enough. So it's not so much to fulfill the mitzvah. If you enjoy it, eat more. When my grandfather was older and he would sit and eat his matzah, and it is well known that the great Chazon Ish of Bnei Brak was very stringent with his measurements and he would eat a lot. So my Saba would say that the Chazon Ish must have been a hungry mensch. Translated, Chazon Ish must have been a hungry person to eat those large measurements. This was my grandfather's little bit of humor for a man he respected and actually had a picture in his office of the Chazon Ish. But nevertheless, this is important to remember. Another piece of information that relates to measurements, the glass for the Seder night should have 3 ounces. The glass, or the becher, if you like becher, I actually found sources, by the way, that consider glass more ideal than silver or even gold for the Seder night, because to see the redness in the glass is considered nice. So I'm not telling you that you have to go out now and put yourself in a makam sakana to buy glasses, but if you do have a choice of a glass versus a becher, a glass is a nice thing as well. We try to use glass, 3 ounces, okay? The minimal amount would be 2.7 ounces, but 3 ounces is a nice amount for your shot glass, and if you drink the majority of that, you fulfill your obligation. That's for the Seder night, okay? Now, people are familiar with the custom of not eating matzah before Pesach. Okay, and I use the word custom, even though it is mentioned in halacha, but I'll clarify it. We want to enter the Seder night with excitement, to the best of our ability this year, but it is important. And I personally love the Seder. It's a very special moment. And part of the excitement is actually tasting the matzah, again, believe it or not. You appreciate things when you did not have the opportunity to benefit from them up until that point. and therefore, halachically speaking, Erev Pesach, you don't eat matzah. No matzah Erev Pesach. There was an opinion that felt, an early opinion that felt that only starts from the time you're not allowed to eat chametz, but we try all of Erev Pesach, no matzah, okay? Egg matzah, by the way, would be permissible, but we Ashkenazim have to follow the tradition of not eating it at a time that we would not be eating chametz. So therefore, after 11:08 a.m., ideally we should not be eating the egg matzah. Now, there are those who don't eat matzah already from Purim. There are those that don't eat it from Rosh Chodesh, right? There are those that don't eat it from Shabbos HaGadol. There are those that don't eat it from the night before. Those are minhagim, but halachically speaking, Erev Pesach, no matzah. However, the good news is that when you take matzah meal and cook it, due to the fact that cooked matzah is not acceptable for the Seder night, because when you cook matzah, it loses its flavor. So since it is not an item that is acceptable for the Seder night, it is acceptable for Erev Pesach. So therefore, from what I've heard, the way you make kneidlach is by taking matzah meal with eggs and probably some other ingredients, and you throw it into a pot, and it is cooked. So therefore, the kneidlach are acceptable Erev Pesach. On the other hand, cookies that have matzah meal are problematic because they are not cooked. So therefore, I still remember as a child that you get this hunger Erev Pesach that there's nothing to eat. I don't know why. That there's nothing to eat, and you would turn to my mother, and what's there to eat? Hard-boiled eggs and potatoes. And I would say, shkayach, that's not exactly what I consider desirable. So I do remember being hungry Erev Pesach. So the good news is that today you can get so many different things, and we've been blessed, even during these times of challenge. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has rachmanas on us and on humanity, that even during times of difficulty, we have the basics. Keep up the good work. But your kneidlach are actually considered acceptable. Now, what I would like to mention is the fact that there's a Mishnah, this is important, by the way, that you're supposed to have an appetite for the Seder, and that's why the last quarter of the day, you shouldn't sit down for a meal. And this year, after 4:50 p.m., my calculations are right, 4:50 p.m. Toronto, I'm sorry, those in Eretz Yisrael, you'll have to calculate on your own, meaning 3 hours before the end of the day, you should not be sitting down for a meal because you want to have an appetite for the Seder night. Okay, let's keep that in mind, but beforehand, you could eat, and although no matzah, the kneidlach, or whatever other wonderful things that we do have in this day and age. One more piece of information is that, as you know, there is a tradition that firstborns fast on Erev Pesach, but due to the fact that this is not Talmudic, we've been trying and we've been successful over the past few decades and centuries to get around the fasting. It would be problematic. You tell me, imagine you fast the whole Erev Pesach, right? Because you're a firstborn. And the first thing that comes into your system is wine and matzah. Will your stomach not rebel? So therefore, we get around it. The way we get around it is by participating in a sudas mitzvah, participating in a festive occasion. And the completion of a tractate, because the study of Torah is indeed what brings us happiness, is what brings it about. So every single year you come to shul, if you're a bechor, and you go ahead and participate. This year, unfortunately, you're not coming to shul, but we're going to Zoom it. I mentioned it already, 8:30 a.m. Erev Pesach. So please eat something afterwards, and you're going to be a participant in that siyum. And Zoom works. This is a psak that goes back to Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, not about Zoom, but about the telephone. So that's one piece of information that's relevant. Seder night, by the way, Seder night, okay, so first of all, a question that was asked is, what about the afikoman and 4 questions when there's no younger generation there to go ahead and ask the question? So when the Seder night, the mitzvah of the Seder night is to have that conversation, and it should be in the format of questions and answers. And therefore, if there are no children there, so the spouse could ask the question. And we are actually told that if you are alone for a Seder, you ask yourself the questions and you give yourself the answer. And although it will be difficult to steal the afikoman and hide it if you're the only one there, right? Unless you forget things, but that could create a different challenge because you're not going to find it. But when it comes to hiding the afikoman, which is a nice custom, especially for children, you could work it out, the couples, if you're with someone else, or even alone. Your yoytze the Seder, what you should do is conceal it. In other words, the afikoman is called safun, it's called conceal. My father would note that it represents the idea that it's like the future redemption. We don't know when it is, it's concealed. We seek, we try to find it. And we try to communicate to our children to try to seek and find, right, behavior that will lead us to the future redemption. So therefore, try to conceal it even under a tablecloth or under some kind of napkin. And that's how you go ahead and deal with the afikoman when you don't have children there. Yeah, so someone mentioned, okay, David, thank you, David, that David says we're all over 60. Some might not remember where we hit it. Don't hide it if you don't remember where you hit it. Okay, so now can one use Zoom for a Ma'ariv minyan? So this is a general question, I understand, from Liz. And you're asking me that, you're asking me oh, this is private, sorry there. So the question is, what about Mincha Ma'ariv Tefillah B'tzibur? It's not a Tefillah B'tzibur if you're not all together. Some shuls are having this nice thing of minyanim at a specific time. Did you see it, everyone, that they have minyanim, that you could go ahead and come together at a specific time? Obviously, you're not going to go ahead and say the Kaddish, but at least it's a feeling of a community. It's a nice thing. But I just can imagine a situation that we have 9 people together on a Zoom waiting for Mincha, and we start calling the 10th person to please get on the Zoom because we want to feel we have a minyan. So I don't know. I personally, this is really, I'll share with you something that I hope you don't hold against me. And it works as follows. I, Baruch Hashem, have been in the rabbinate for 23 years. And I take my responsibility very, very seriously. And I come to minyanim and I give mincha ma'ariv talks, and I'm punctual. And this challenging time, which is by the way, even though I'm giving these talks of being optimistic, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with what's occurring in the world, just for the record. I'm struggling with it. I'm not going to use the word depression, but after Shabbos is the hardest for me. After Shabbos, I feel so rotten. I feel bad for my wife. I am very, after Shabbos, when I turn on and I start reading what's happening, I feel, I don't know, it's just terrible. It's just a very, very hard, and I'm trying to be optimistic and all that. But reality is this is a very painful experience, and God Almighty is communicating with humanity that, you know what, you guys are not in charge. You got to clean up. And I think if indeed we're turning to God Almighty to return to the normal, we better promise him that we're going to make it a better normal. A better normal, in other words, when it comes to shul, for example. We want God Almighty to give us the ability to return to shul. I committed to God Almighty that bli neder, that if there's ever talking again Kriyas HaTorah in shul, I'm going to get very upset. That's what I committed myself, because who am I to ask him that we return to have minyanim if we weren't doing things we shouldn't, right? Obviously, you all agree that if we're watching a good movie, right? And you're watching The Godfather, for example, right? And right before Al Pacino says something, I start talking out loud. You would get upset at me that you couldn't hear the dialogue between Al Pacino and whatever. So lahavdil, I think in a shul too, we have to do something to commit to God Almighty that we're going to upgrade a little bit, because that's my personal conversation I'm having with God, because I do believe that we have to work on that. But what's occurring for me to go ahead and have a Zoom with people, it doesn't talk to me. It's not the real thing. It's not the real thing. And I'm praying for the real thing. If some people have this need to daven in chamar with others, there's opportunities. I'm waiting for the real thing, because it is meaningful. It is meaningful. It's important for me. And I hope, Bezrat Hashem, that we merit it, because these are not easy times. When you read about the news, when you read about the fact that, to think about it, and this I heard from a well-respected posek in Chicago, that to read in the news that the 3 locations where people are ignoring, perhaps not now, but this was last week, that people are ignoring guidelines, are Borough Park, Williamsburg, and Crown Heights. I mean, you go out of your mind of what's happening. These are very upsetting times. These are hard times, painful times. And, so therefore this little bit of a Zoom minion doesn't do for me what I need. Believe me, I'm looking forward to the day that with Bezrat Hashem we merit, and we should be deserving of the upgraded, the real thing. That's what I do have. The 4 questions, you don't have to stand for the 4 questions. That's not part of the requirement. Now, Seder night, by the way, ideally, the 4 cups are due to the fact that they are an integral part of the Seder. You should start the Seder when it's dark, even though here in Toronto it's quite late this year. 8:38 would be the ideal time. In case of great need, you could already start your Seder 8:20. You hear what I'm saying? I'm going to try 8:38. In case of great need, you could do it already 25 minutes after Shkia. So without getting into all the details, there's makom for leniency, because it's a late one, especially for, even without kids, but for the older crowd. Let's see, any other questions coming in? I'm trying to see here. Anyway, if you do have specifics, we could be in touch. I do thank everyone for participating. This does give us a sense of community here, because we're communicating, we're concerned for one another, and we do have to give chizuk to one another. There's no question about it, because alone, right? When you talk about Eicha, Tisha B'Av, what really defines Tisha B'Av? Eicha Yashva Badad, alone. And we can't be alone. We have to feel that there's a concern for one another, and that's what we are doing now. We're communicating through phone call, through the Zoom program. Bezrat Hashem, next week again, we're going to have the opportunity to have a few discussion, a little bit of a discussion that relates to Pesach. And what I could tell you is that we will get Bezrat Hashem over it. We'll take care of our health. We'll do our part, and we'll merit indeed to do so. Thank you all for making this a Kehillah community. Thank you all for participating. If we're going to unmute everyone, if anyone has any specifics, so I got here, thank you, and a Chag Kosher v'Sameach from one and all. Take care of yourselves, do your part, do your hishtadlut, stay healthy, okay? Stay healthy, eat well, and eat those things that are good for us. Keep away from human beings, okay? Interact with others through screens. Be machmir when it comes to your health, and be makel when it comes to areas that don't relate to it. That's what a good Jew does. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach. We'll still be in touch.
Very much, Rabbi.
Chag Sameach. Can I share?
Well, just a message to those in Israel. The Palestinians are watching, and who else? Yvonne, and you in Israel have more of a responsibility to pray. You got it? So I'm putting a burden on you, because you're closer to God Almighty, and you do your part. Okay? And think of us as well. Much appreciated.
Can I share here's the kever of the Maharil?
Yes.
Okay. It's the kever of the Maharil, and what's interesting is that All the other kvaros are facing the wrong direction. This is the only one facing Yerushalayim.
Interesting.